Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota writers and books. I'm Mark Oyaas, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Northfield Historical Society and Museum. And I'm here with an old friend of Northern Lights, John Koblas. Hi, how are you, John?
Just
Koblas.
fine, thank you.
Well, this is my first visit to the Historical Society and the museum, but you've spent a lot of time down here, haven't you, John?
I've spent a lot of time over the years. I was working on my first book on Jessie James. I started in 1982, and I spent a lot of time here at the Historical Society, also quite a bit of time over at the Northfield Public Library.
You're no stranger to Northern Lights. I introduced you as an old friend. You were on before talking about your work with, what, F. Scott Fitzgerald, is that right?
Yes, 1996.
And you've also done a considerable amount of work with Sinclair Lewis, right?
That's correct, yes. Did, over the years, I published 6 books on F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis.
What's the fascination with those characters?
Well, actually, they were Minnesota authors, so they were much easier to research. I didn't have to travel across the country to do a lot of research. And as a youngster, I was pretty fascinated with F. Scott Fitzgerald and started digging into his life. Completed that book, and then Russ Fridley, the director of the Minnesota Historical Society, one day stopped by to drop off some slides I needed for a lecture, and he saw a Sinclair Lewis book on the piano and said, "Why don't you do a book on Lewis?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really that crazy about Lewis." And he left, and a week later I was working on a book on Lewis.
Did you, you weren't that crazy about Lewis, but what was it about him that kept you going and doing all that work?
Well, I saw him as writing Main Street, Free Air, Babbitt, some novels I liked, but I was in a different mood at that time, and what I didn't take into consideration was the man's life. He was a dichotomy of his own nature. He was even more exciting to read about than his own fiction.
In what way?
Well, I'll just give you one little anecdote. He went to a party in Mankato. All the people were partying in the parlor. He crept upstairs when no one knew he had left the room. He went into the host's bedroom. This was a lady. Went into her closet, put on one of her formal gowns, came downstairs and started talking to guests dressed in the formal gown as if nothing had happened. The woman was absolutely shocked. And this was the kind of thing he did everywhere he went, which didn't always make him popular.
Well, I'd like to talk to you, as long as we've got the chance and the setting, about some of the books you published more recently with North Star Press.
Yes.
And those include, if my memory serves me correctly, Willow River Almanac. Let's start with that. I've found it fascinating and certainly a diversion from your other work. It's a personal memoir. Why don't you tell viewers what possessed you to write it and take us through a little bit about your...
Well, I went through a divorce, and I was going through a divorce in 1987. I didn't, after being married for 25 years, I didn't really want to sit and talk about the divorce with other people. I felt I had to get away. I had grown up reading Henry Beston and Thoreau, of course. So I decided to go off into the woods. I picked Willow River State Park, just east of Hudson, Wisconsin. And I spent a very cold month of October there recording flora, fauna, local history, geology, and with this I tossed in all my own emotions, memories, and put it all together, not knowing initially that I was writing a book. The funny thing about Willow River Almanac is the Jessie James book that I did took me 16 years to research and write. The Civil War book I did took all of 7 years. Willow River Almanac took only 31 days, and it was the hardest book I've ever had to write.
It's what must have been cathartic for you. It pulls you in ways that I'm a cynic, and I read the back of the book and I think, I don't know that this is for me necessarily. And I'm so pleased I had a chance to be exposed to it, because there's emotions we all have, shared emotions, and there's your own insights which are interesting, and it's a quick read. It's a wonderful read. And
Well, thank you.
has it been fairly well received?
It's been very well received. It's still a little tender, though. I go into a bookstore and am asked to do a reading. Some of it still hurts pretty badly, and it's hard for me. And once in a while, at one bookstore, my voice even cracked when I started to read a couple passages. First thing, the red lights came on. I said, next time I read, I don't read those passages.
Huh.
So.
Well, yeah, I would suggest that people pick it up and read read the book in its entirety, because it's a great read, and it's an insight into your own writing style that I've actually read the next book that I'd like to mention first, about Dickison and the swamp fox of Florida. I remember as a kid, we'd divide up, some were Rebs and some were Yanks, so we'd fight in the backyard. And I had one friend in particular who always wanted to be the swamp fox, and I knew nothing about the swamp fox, but you reveal quite a bit. How do you go from F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis to Dickison, the swamp fox?
Well, I've always written about local history. Obviously, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis. Then the book on Jessie James, I wrote about Jessie James. But I was really writing about Minnesota, about Northfield and Madelia. J.J. Dickison, Swamp Fox of the Confederacy, was kind of a departure here, because I'm writing about the state of Florida during the Civil War. But in another sense, it really was not. I had gone down to Florida. I spent 3 years there, and I started researching this J.J. Dickison. So I was actually, although I've lived in Minnesota all my life, the 3 years I spent in Florida, I considered myself a Floridian for those 3 years, and I was at home doing research about someone from the home state, Florida.
It was a surprise to me to learn. I don't even think about Florida as a member of the Confederacy, and in some ways, neither did Davis or Lincoln, for that matter. Isn't that right?
Or Walt Disney.
Yeah, they just wrote the whole thing off as what, swampland?
Yeah, swampland. It was a virtual swampland. Lincoln didn't really care much about Florida. It could do no damage to the Union. Jeff Davis really didn't care about it. Florida, during the Civil War, sent 15,000 troops to fight for the Confederacy. The problem here was almost all of those 15,000 troops were called upon outside the state's borders, up in Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, to clash with the Union there, which left no one in Florida to protect the women and children. And they really needed protecting. War is a horrible thing. There seldom is the good guy versus the bad guy. There are good and bad on both sides, and there was a lot going on in Florida.
Well, what was the swamp fox's role in all of this?
Well, like I say, someone had to protect the women and children. He gathered an army of, well, it usually ran about 40 to 400 men. It never exceeded 400. He decided to defend north central Florida. These huge Union armies of 6,000 men would come down. Very often Union troops would be camped. There would be 1,000 Union troops sitting around these campfires. Dickison and his men would come out of the swamps, yell out, "We've got you surrounded. We're going to kill every one of you if you don't surrender." So the Union officer in charge would come forward, "We surrender." At this point, 40 men step out of the bushes with these old muskets, and
the original, what we think of now as guerrilla war, one of the original tacticians of guerrilla war then was the swamp fox.
yes, very much so.
It's the war is here's a profound thing I'm about to say, that war has such a dramatic effect on a country and on a people and on individual people, and really much of what happened here in Northfield started in some ways, in reading your book, during the Civil War, and with Jessie and Frank James and the younger brothers and the gang. Would you talk a little bit about their background? We've heard some of it, and we'll unfold the story as you've written it today. But would you talk a little bit about the background of those guys and what they were like during the war?
Well, there was the border war between Missouri and Kansas. it was pretty horrible, regardless of what side of the state line you lived on. The Jameses and the Youngers were semi-average farmers growing up. Where they got into trouble was well, not Jessie so much, he was pretty young, but Frank, Cole Younger, and some of the others went off to fight for the Confederacy. Frank James was in the regular Confederate Army. He fought at the Battle of Lexington and at others in Missouri. But then this corps of guys got involved with Quantrell's raiders, who were pretty ruthless. Some of it was in retaliation of atrocities conducted on people in Missouri, but somehow they went over to Lawrence, Kansas, burned the town down, looted it, killed every male. This included young boys. If they were old enough to hold a gun, they were old enough to shoot. If you were a female, you were pretty well off compared to the alternative of being a male. So Frank was a very hunted man after this.
So the war ends, and what happens to these characters? They just never really recover from the shock or the...
Well, no. At the end of the Civil War, if you were a Confederate soldier, all you had to do was report to any Union facility and turn in your weapon, take the oath of allegiance to the good old USA, and go home and work your farm, providing you still had a farm. While Jessie and Frank came forward, Jessie was carrying a white flag. Union troops opened fire on them, shooting Jessie in the chest. They got away. Frank got him to a doctor, saved his life. The problem is, why did Union troops fire on these two young men? Well, it was because of their involvement, at least Frank's involvement, with Quantrell.
So they knew who they were, those Union...
They knew who they were, and most people looked upon Quantrell's unit as not a regular branch of the Confederacy at all. They were merely a band of outlaws fighting on the same side as the Confederacy, but they were also helping themselves. They were filling their own pockets. And so these two guys, who probably weren't the nicest young men to begin with, turned into some pretty ruthless characters, and then the story comes along, robbing the banks, robbing the trains. Once you rob trains, the We Never Sleep people, the Pinkertons, move in, and then you're in a world of trouble.
It was almost a private precursor to the FBI, the Pinkertons, weren't they? I mean, they crossed state borders, they had a mission, they focused, they did research, and... Because
they worked really for the railroad, so they could go across these state borders. There were no borders. They were invisible to them.
The book we're here to talk about, and the setting that we're in, is, of course, Northfield and the Historical Society. The surprise for me, when we opened, there's the talk of the 8 raiders and the fuselage of bullets, but really your book is a whole new look at what happened that day, and it's the subtitle is what? The Confessions of the Ninth Man. Mm-hmm. How did you stumble upon the story of Bill Stiles, and would you share a little bit about it with us?
Well, in a lot of my research, I came across many accounts of there being as many as 9 to 12 robbers. We do know, at least I'm totally convinced, there were actually only 8 men in the town of Northfield robbing the bank. I came across some material in the basement of a historical society. There were letters from a man who showed up at a mission in Los Angeles in 1913 who claimed to have lived on after the Northfield raid as Bill Stiles. You have to be leery of these individuals. There were about 20-some fake Jessies. Everybody wanted to have a hand in it. So I'm not sure I really believe this man or not. There are some things in his favor. His father came down to Northfield, took one look at the supposed body of his son and walked away happy man, and said that that was not his son. There were other relatives who also said that. And on the other hand, there were a couple who did look at him and say the same thing. Where his story really falls apart is he claims he was waiting at the edge of town, probably had fresh horses. If you're going to have someone cover your escape route, it's best to have a man from Minnesota. He was from Minnesota. I'll give him that. But in his story, it comes out that he and Frank and Jessie James went northeast, went up into Grantsburg, Wisconsin, ended up in a Chippewa Indian village in Wisconsin, got patched up and came home. If this man Stiles, claiming to be Bill Stiles at the mission, said any of this, it's an outright lie. We know, at least we're almost positive, they did not go to Wisconsin. However, the man who interviewed him, Ed Earl Repp, was a pulp writer. Repp wrote westerns. Repp also wrote fantasy and science fiction for a lot of the old pulp magazines, Amazing, Astounding, and all these kind of magazines. And so this man, Stiles, later claimed that it was Repp who manufactured a lot of this information. So it really depends on who's telling the story here. If it was Ed Earl Repp manufacturing this, then there might be some credibility in this man's statement. If this man said it himself about Wisconsin and some of these other stories, then the man was a liar.
Most of our viewers are at least somewhat familiar with what went on in September 1876 down in Northfield, but it sits in our memories as we know it was a dust-up, a brouhaha of some proportion. There's at least 2 people were killed. Why don't you, before we set the stage of that day, why don't you talk about how the Youngers and the Jameses got together? They really seemed to be, reading through your book, 2 different families and different personalities and makeups, weren't they? And the Youngers and the James.
Somewhat, and yet in some ways they were somewhat similar. The story I have came from Cole Younger much later. Cole claims that 3 men met in Monaga Cave outside Kansas City in Missouri. The 3 men were Jesse James, Bob Younger, and of course Bill Stiles. And Stiles urged Jesse to come up to Minnesota. There's a misconception here that they left Missouri coming up to rob the First National Bank in Northfield. They knew nothing about Northfield at this time at all. Stiles wanted them to come up to Minnesota and just rob a bank. He said that the Minnesotans were so easy and that they would not recognize a band of outlaws if it surrounded them. What he had not taken into consideration, of course, was all these people in Northfield and many of these other communities had fought in the Civil War only 11 years before. They were still crack shots. They were anything but helpless. They were anything but ridiculous. So they came up to Minnesota and they checked out a lot of areas. There's stories of them in Freeborn County. There are stories of them, of course, in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We do know they were in Minneapolis, St. Paul, probably Red Wing, Cordova, St. Peter, Faribault, Madelia, Mankato. They made the rounds looking for a bank to rob.
Well, were these sightings something like, or akin at all to the gangsters that we saw in the 20s and 30s, the Capone? Did people know who they were when they were wandering around the streets of Minneapolis, or?
No, not really. And you have to be careful when you're sifting through all that information, because almost every family between here and Kansas City has a Jesse James story where, especially after the robbery, where they stopped at the farm, left money under the plate. I had one lady call me up and say that they were definitely at her grandfather's farm in Worthington, because when they were inside eating, the posse crept up and let the air out of their tires. So you can't really believe everything everybody tells you. And if number one, they would not have had time to sit and eat all these meals. Number 2, had they would have been 300 pounds by the time they got back home.
In terms of, were the James the leaders of the crew that came to Northfield that day in
No,
September?
not at all. That's another misconception. Jesse James was not the leader of the gang by any means. The real leaders were probably Frank James and Cole Younger. Depending on how much credibility goes to Bill Stiles, in a sense, he could have been regarded as an almost a leader, because he was the guy that knew the roads, he knew the land, the rivers up here in Minnesota, and was somewhat responsible for planning it. Jesse James later, after 2 years after the raid in Northfield, he did start a new gang in Nashville, Tennessee, with Whiskey Head Bill Ryan and Fletch Taylor and a few of these other desperados.
But as you outlined so wonderfully in the book, and everything is documented, and we're drawing in a real clear picture of who these people are. The Youngers weren't necessarily cold-blooded killers. Doesn't the story go that they only killed somebody who robbed their parents, or how?
Well, Cole liked to claim they were just peaceful, loving farmers. I think, and it's been written by several authors, I think they were a product of the Civil War. They learned to be nasty pretty early on because it meant survival. And then they took it several steps above this and became some pretty nasty characters. Cole Younger may have been one of the nicest of the crew. He was somewhat educated. He and Frank quoted Shakespeare and the Bible, while some of the others would just as well, likely blow your head off if you looked at them. But they could be pretty nasty too, and consensus is it was probably Frank James who shot Mr. Joseph Lee Haywood here in the bank at Northfield. Had the Civil War not happened, perhaps they'd have grown up differently. Had there not been this border conflict, Kansas and Missouri, followed by the war between the states, they may have grown up okay.
Mm-hmm. So here's this crew up here looking for Yankee gold. There's at least, we know, the 2 James boys, the 3 Youngers, and a couple of other hands, including Clell Miller, is that right? And another fellow, Chadwick?
Bill Chadwick was also known as Bill Chadwell, Bill Stiles,
okay,
and had several other aliases. But that's pretty much the nucleus.
And the plan was, once they staked out this bank, they'd been around, they're looking as you described, and that once they staked out the bank here in Northfield, what was the plan?
Well, they decided to rob the bank, but it took quite a while. They were looking in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Red Wing, and all these other communities, and then they heard that a couple Union generals who were somewhat hated in the South, especially General Beast Butler, as he was called, by Southerners, and General Ames were here, had their money here in Northfield. And so these were the people that he wanted to strike back at, people like Butler.
So there was that motivation continued right through to the...
Some people look at the Northfield Raid as the last battle of the Civil War.
Do you feel that way? You come to that conclusion with all the work you've done? And
well, when I was doing the Dickison book down in Florida, I went to one of the reenactments, and I was on the Confederate side of the field. It's kind of like in high school where the kids from one school are on one side and the other, so they can't fight, but they do anyway. That's what it reminded me of. There were 2 ladies well up in their 80s, and they were sitting in lawn chairs, and they were screaming, "Kill those blankety-blank Yankees," over and over and over. I was afraid to open my mouth.
One of the things I'm struck with reading your book is the celebrity of these characters, and as much even today as there's gang life, and some of the kids, the rap singers have some connections to the gangs of today. There's a certain celebrity. The women fawned over them, to a certain extent, and reading those fascinating account of the Youngers' stay in Stillwater Prison, where people would visit them and call on them, is. What do you attribute that celebrity to? These were, after all, bank robbers and killers.
It has never changed. They are still fighting the establishment today in the year 2000, and that's what these guys were doing. You can look at them as being almost anti-capitalist. They were trying to strike back at the rich, and you have to be careful with this stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, because it really wasn't quite like that. But it was really fighting the establishment, which is why people look at rock singers today, because they're doing the same thing. So and you have to think back to the time of Cole Younger and the Jameses. There were no televisions, there were no radios. What did people in a small town do for excitement? Suddenly they hear about these bold robbers, and suddenly these men who should have been infamous suddenly become celebrities.
There was actually a movement to pardon the Youngers, isn't that right?
Oh yes, it went on for several years. Some of the most prominent Minnesotans pushed for a pardon. Our first state governor, Henry Sibley, pushed for it. Alexander Ramsey, first territorial governor, second state governor, he pushed for a pardon. Many prominent people, even some of the captors, some of the men called the Magnificent Seven in Madelia, who went in and were the ones that captured the Youngers and killed Charlie Pitts. Some of those also fought for a pardon for the Youngers.
There's so much to talk about. That it's such a rich chapter in Minnesota history, and you've done an incredible job. I'm going to use a word again because your narrative is compelling, and your recreation of dialogue is it's fascinating. A reader, when you read the Northfield Raid, you really are pulled back into that era and all that that era means. It's great work. Now you're doing some other work on Jesse James, isn't that right?
Yes, I'm doing, I just finished this past week a James Younger Gang tour book, more or less, of kind of divided into, well, I can't say it's divided into 3 sections, but it includes 3 kinds of material: places that they were, places where they may have been, and places where they absolutely were not, but some people think they were. And when I find places like that, I tell the story, but then I say there was absolutely no truth to this. But I mean, a lot of the stories you don't hear about after they get out of prison. Cole and Jim Younger are off selling tombstones. So now what I've been doing for the last month is making a lot of phone calls up to places like Staples, Wadena, Purim, Cloquet, where they attended a revival meeting in Cloquet, or where Cole was staying at the Merchants Hotel in Purim or Wadena. Well, what was Cole doing there? And finding out who they wrote letters to, and did they talk about anything going on in these little towns? Because when you read about the boys in Minnesota, it wasn't only here in Northfield and Madelia. It's like all of Minnesota had a connection, even way up in Duluth, and again nearly to Fargo, North Dakota. The Jesse James book I did for North Star Press, fall of 1999, has recently been filmed as a documentary movie for television. It is being done by the Old West Society, a local Minnesota group. I took some footage with my own home movie camera that I'd like to show here. Keep in mind, this is not actual footage from the film. It is not professionally done. It is John Koblas, movie camera novice, taking some pictures here.
Moving. Action.
The scene we're looking at now is the actual Northfield raid. This was not filmed, the exterior was not filmed in Northfield because of the paved streets and some of the modern buildings. What you're looking at here took place at Murphy's Landing, a renovation of roughly 100 buildings in Shakopee, Minnesota. And here we're looking at the exterior footage of what we think happened at the robbery itself.
Your body of work is a wonderful resource for all of us who are interested in Minnesota history and these special chapters. Thank you very much, John, for coming.
Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
John Koblas, thank you very much for joining Northern Lights. Thank you for allowing me to host a special edition of your program down here in the Northfield Historical Society and Museum and Gift Shop. It's a wonderful place to come. I'm going shopping when we're through here. Thanks again.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.